Welcome to tonight's virtual program. I'm Em. I'm one of the librarians here at Rockland Public Library, and we're thrilled to be hosting tonight's talk. I want to start tonight with a couple quick programming notes on upcoming virtual events here at Rockland Public Library. Next week on February 4th, author, photographer, and columnist Don Reimer will discuss his new book, Seen Anything Good, which talks about birding in Maine. And on February 11th, Tim Caverly of Allagash Tales will be providing a Valentine's Day themed presentation on the story of him and his wife, which takes place in part on the trails of Baxter State Park. And I'm happy to introduce tonight's speaker. Liam Riordan is an early American historian specializing in the Revolutionary era, and he has been a faculty member at UMaine since 1997. He has done considerable public history work to commemorate the bicentennial of the state of Maine and organized a public scholarly conference on the statehood era and its legacy in 2019. And I'm happy to turn it over to Liam.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the Rockland Public Library hosting me and Em's work to get us up and running. I think I'm successfully sharing my screen with all of you. And so I actually can't see my Zoom screen right now. Let me see if I can rearrange things just a bit so that I can. Stop. So for some reason, when I share screen, I can't see the Zoom box. So I won't be able to see chats that come in while I have that up, but hopefully I'll toggle back and forth and we can figure that out when we shift over to a discussion portion of the talk. So my plan is to speak for something like 30 or 45 minutes about the Maine statehood process, and then I'm happy to take questions for as long as we can all stand it. So thanks a lot for coming. And I start my talk with this image, which I think is the most widely recognized symbol of the Maine State Bicentennial, which is the commemorative license plate that was issued by the state of Maine that many people in the audience probably purchased and put on the front bumper of their car. I think that we get a special dispensation because of COVID. We're allowed to keep it up into 2021, but I think we're supposed to take them down pretty soon. But the real thing I like about this image is the way that it at least implicitly asks us whether or not there is a connection between 2020 and 1820. I mean, other than the fact that we have 10 fingers and count by decades and centuries, there isn't an inherent significance in a round number like a bicentennial. And so I think we do have a real question to ask ourselves. Is there a meaningful connection between our contemporary moment and Maine statehood 200 years ago? And I, of course, am an early American historian. I am committed to the idea that the distant past is significant for us in the present. But this is not always an easy thing to argue in 21st century American society, where I would say we are not just very present focused, we're very future focused. I don't know that in our daily lives we give a whole lot of thought about the distant past. And so in that sense, I really appreciate a bicentennial. I think it is a way to help early American history pierce the public consciousness in a unique way and encourages us to think a little bit about what we want history to do to us. So history can entertain, it can inform, it can instruct, but at its very best, historical understanding helps us to grasp a deeper meaning about our society, our culture, and even about our sense of self. And I think what history can do for us in this way is to help us expand our gaze from the individual and the personal to something broader that we share as a community. And I think this is all the more pressing today in our extremely polarized contemporary moment, giving some more attention to what we share in the past can have a really valuable role to play in contemporary society. It can contribute to civic virtue and can even help us to think a bit about the future. So I want to start my talk about the Maine statehood era by beginning with just the most obvious fact about Maine statehood, and that is that Maine became the 23rd U.S. state on March 15th, 1820. The state has a literal birthday that, of course, this last year, the bicentennial of that birthday was dramatically overshadowed by COVID bursting on the scene 24 hours, 48 hours before the actual bicentennial moment was set to kick off. Now, I do think that specific moment in time is a useful frame of reference. And here I am pairing it with what I like to think of as the first official map of the state of Maine. I'm told it's not really an official map, but certainly one of the earliest ones to identify this region not as the District of Maine, part of Massachusetts, but as a state in its own right. And the cartographer who made this map, Moses Greenleaf, is a really fascinating figure. I'm going to talk a little bit more about him later when I share another map that he made. And I want to give a shout out to the Osher Map Library at the University of Southern Maine. It is a world-class map library, and they, as part of the UMaine system, are very conscious of their public mission. It is accessible to anyone, and they've digitized a huge amount of their collection. So if you are a map buff or a history lover, I really encourage you to check out the Osher Map Library's website and see all of the great material they have. They have a large collection of Moses Greenleaf material. They do have a lot about Maine and the northern boundary of Maine in particular, but they have Renaissance maps, they have world maps. It's really quite an amazing institution and well worth getting to know better. Now, even though I take March 15th, 1820 as a good starting point for this talk, I also think it's a little bit misleading because it takes us to a single day, a single moment. And I want to talk a little bit more broadly about Maine in the statehood era and some of the crucial events that informed how Maine became a state, some of which stretch several decades before 1820, and the most famous of which lingers a little bit after the actual date of Maine statehood. So my talk tonight is really going to center on three questions, and these are posing three questions that really connect Maine in the statehood era to Maine today. And I think in all three cases, we will right away recognize that the issues that were in play around these themes in the statehood era are also very much with us in the 21st century. And again, this is part of the value that I think history offers to our self-understanding and our sense of who we are as Maine residents, but also as American citizens. So the first of the three connections that I want to talk about is the first of these three past-present connections is, I think, the single most famous issue related to the statehood era in Maine. And this is a kind of confusing and somewhat complicated question that I have to say I did not really understand very well until I began to do research on the Maine statehood era to sort of prepare for talks like this and to better understand the history of Maine. Having a little trouble with my cursor. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So the first of the past present connections I want to talk about is, how is Maine statehood somehow connected to slavery? And this is a little bit puzzling, I think. Maine in the statehood era did not have slavery as a legal institution. It had a relatively small population of free people of African descent, yet Maine's becoming a state is fundamentally linked with the most explosive public political crisis over slavery in the early national era of the United States. So I pose this first past present connection along with this map, a sort of classic map. Some version of this appears in most US history textbooks these days, whether for high school students or for college students. And of course, it helps to explain how the admission of Missouri as a slave state and the admission of Maine as a free state were connected in 1820 and 1821. Now, as I began to do a little bit more research to understand this crisis moment in American national politics, I came to decide that I think there are some very basic elements in this textbook map that are misleading. And this has to do with the basic name that is often given to this event. So at one of the very first talks I gave about Maine statehood, I showed this image, and right away a person's hand went up and they were upset because they said, well, when I was in school, I was taught this as the Maine-Missouri Compromise, and I'm annoyed that it only acknowledges Missouri here. And I think that's a good point. They were both involved in the resolution of this crisis. And in fact, Maine was a much larger population territory district than Missouri at the time. Maine really was much weightier in this than the Missouri territory that was still a distant and small populated place. But in a sense, that's a sort of small quibble about Maine and Missouri, and we can have state pride and say that Maine should be in that title. But what I came to discover was that I also think calling the resolution of this crisis a compromise is misleading. And in order to explain why I think it's misleading, we have to dig a little bit deeper into the really fascinating process by which this national crisis burst on the scene. So Maine had voted, the Maine public had voted in favor of separating from Massachusetts. This was approved by the Massachusetts legislature. And so Maine crafted a constitution and then submitted that to the US Congress in December 1819, along with a petition to become an independent state. And right away, a huge problem was clear, because months before this, Missouri had applied to be a state, but it had been blocked. And it was blocked in a way that really had brought national politics in the US Congress to a standstill. So here's a good past-present connection. Washington, D.C. politicians in 1819 and 1820 did not get along, could not agree, were so furious that national politics was stuck over this issue. The House of Representatives had voted in favor of a bill to deny Missouri admission if it would allow slavery as legal. And the US Senate opposed that requirement of Missouri statehood. So Maine comes along several months later, months into this bitter, divided situation, and it is immediately clear that Maine is not going to be able to avoid getting pulled into this terrible stalemate. So right away, one of the Maine representatives to Congress writes to William King, the leading politician who was in favor of Maine statehood, to warn him of just how tangled this situation was. And what's particularly interesting in this letter is that Mark Langdon Hill, the Maine congressman from Phippsburg, wrote to King to urge him that people in Maine should, quote, say nothing opposed to the wishes of the Southern people. And he added, I hope the people of Maine will remain still on the slave question. Now, this is particularly interesting because William King, who had been raised in Scarborough, Maine, with his half-brother Rufus, wasn't so sure where he stood on this issue. And part of the reason is that his stepbrother, Rufus King, was a US Senator from the state of New York who was a leader of the anti-slavery stance in the US Congress. So King waffles momentarily. Maybe he'll side with his brother. Maybe he'll take what we clearly would see as the more moral stand and say that Maine statehood should not be connected in any way with the expansion of slavery to Missouri. But King does not side with his brother. And he ultimately agrees with the advice of Mark Langdon Hill that Maine statehood is a goal worth getting, even if it gets entangled with the moral failure of expanding slavery. Now, this remains an incredibly contested issue in the US Congress, and the newspaper in Portland, the Eastern Argus, reports on this in January 1820, and I think it gives a really nice flavor of just how explosive it was, just how aware of this issue people were who followed national politics in the US in this critical moment of Maine attempting to become a state. So the Eastern Argus wrote in its article about the situation on January 25th, 1820, quote, the debate on the Missouri question has at last commenced in the Senate and absorbs so much attention that until it is indefinitely settled, it may almost be said that no other business will be done in Congress. Never were the galleries and lobbies more crowded. Now, the final vote that went before the House of Representatives ended up passing in favor of slavery expanding as a legal institution in Missouri, with Maine coming in as a free state. And it passed by the narrowest of margins, 90 in favor and 87 congressmen opposed. Now, what is really fascinating about that incredibly close vote is what the 7 US congressmen from Maine, the votes that they took on this bill in 1820. So there's an interesting past-present non-connection. Maine, when it was just a district, a part of Massachusetts, had 7 representatives in the House of Representatives. So again, the population of Maine in 1820 relative to the rest of the US was quite a bit more robust then. And so of these 7 Maine congressmen, the majority, 5 of them, voted against Maine's admission to the United States. They said, look, if the terms of Maine becoming a state are this complicated package of bills that is also going to allow slavery to expand to Missouri, then we are opposed to it. And keep in mind, in a 90 to 87 vote, if the 2 in the minority in Maine had joined with their colleagues in the majority, it would have blocked this as a resolution of this searing crisis over slavery and the future of the United States. Now, one thing that, of course, is true of politics in 1820, as it is today, when politicians have to take a stand on a really controversial issue, they generally have to explain why they did so to the public. And so the slide we're seeing here are the public letters of congressmen on both sides of this issue, the four who opposed Maine statehood and in opposing Maine statehood took an anti-slavery stand. 4 of the 5 wrote a joint letter to their voters that appears on the left here, and one of the 2 in favor wrote separate letters, but the more famous of the 2 was by John Holmes, who was the US congressman from Alfred, Maine. And I want to read just a little bit of the letter from, this is again the public letter published in the newspaper by 4 of the 5 Maine congressmen who opposed Maine statehood through this particular route. And they explained that they took this vote because of their fear of slave power, that they thought it would corrupt Republican government, and that it was, quote, abhorrent to their notions of the rights of man and humanity to participate in the expansion of slavery. And then their closing line, which again takes me back to why I no longer agree with the way the Maine-Missouri Crisis is presented in that textbook map, their final line states, "It is a falsehood to call this a compromise. We utterly protest against and refuse to sanction it with our approbation." So right, they're saying this is not a compromise. We do not agree with it. We do not like it. This is something that is forced upon us, and we should not identify it as a compromise, something that is a reasonable resolution of the crisis. Now, the final thing I want to say about this first past present connection is that I think it reminds us of the extraordinary importance of Blackness in American political life, even in a state like Maine that does not have a large population of people of African descent. This is a legacy of incredible importance because slavery is so much at the center of American history. So whether it's the Maine-Missouri Crisis of 1820 or the Black Lives Matter movement of the contemporary moment, Maine, as part of American political culture, is deeply invested and imbricated in the politics of Blackness in the United States. All right, let me move on to my second of 3 past-present connections. And this is, again, to shift our gaze a bit away from the statehood moment of 1820. But now we're going to grapple a little bit with the long period that it took for Maine to become a state. And I think this is also a little puzzling to us in 2021 to think, why would it have been a hard decision for Maine residents in the late 18th or early 19th century to say they wanted to be separate from Massachusetts, right? In contemporary Maine, we are aware of a fair bit of animosity toward people from away or toward flatlanders. So we would think if Mainers had a choice to break this connection, they would do so pretty quickly and pretty overwhelmingly. But that is not at all the way that Maine became a state. So this is to point out that sometimes our present understanding and our present perspective can get in the way of an accurate historical understanding. for Maine voters in this period, deciding to separate from Massachusetts was a very difficult decision. And in fact, it took 6 popular votes before a sufficient number of residents of the District of Maine could agree that separating from Massachusetts was a good idea. And again, these are popular votes that are sanctioned by the Massachusetts legislature, the first one in 1792, and of course, the final successful one in July of 1819. Now, the maps that we're looking at here give us a sort of color-coded guide to county level support for the independence movement in purple and county level opposition to the independence movement in green. So green areas opposed independence and wanted to stay part of Massachusetts. Purple areas were strongly in support. Now, what is interesting to me is that if we just think about the change in color in these maps over the course of the 6 votes, we can see that it's a very topsy-turvy sort of process. It's not a gradual movement where each map gets a little more purple, a little more purple, a little more purple, right? I mean, in a sense, the 1819 map is kind of boring. There we've got a majority of Maine voters in every county favoring statehood. The weakest vote for statehood in 1819 at the county level was in Hancock County, which I think was 52% in favor of statehood. But we can see that the road to get to that position was contested and uneven. And in fact, the lowest vote in favor of Maine independence comes right in the middle in 1807, when every single county, with the exception of Kennebec County, favored staying part of Massachusetts. Now, there's a whole lot more things I could say about these state level votes and the way they connect to partisan politics and Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. And so if that interests you, I would love to come back to this map and talk a bit more about it in the question and answer period. But it is one of those moments when I can go off the rails and get too deep into the weeds and the details of early American political history. I will point out one last thing before we move on. And we might note that it's sort of curious that there are 2 votes held in 1816. And again, we would think these would be spaced out and happen over a period of time. Why is it that the Massachusetts legislature allowed this vote on the independence question in May of 1816, and then did so again just a couple of months later? So certainly one of the seismic shifts in the Maine statehood movement was the War of 1812. This raised consciousness in the District of Maine of their distance from the center of political power in Boston. And when British troops occupied much of eastern Maine, the Massachusetts government did very little to try to dislodge the British. So it really revives the statehood movement in the post-War of 1812 period, right? That war ends in 1815. The vote in May of 1816 gives a very strong statewide vote, 62% in favor of independence. But there was a little bit of a problem because the turnout in that election was really low. And so to confirm it, they had another vote in September. And at this point, the Massachusetts legislature is basically thinking that Maine is going to become independent. So they say, look, we're going to do that second vote in September. And at the same time that we just confirm that this is what Maine wants to do, we also want you to elect delegates to a state constitutional convention. Well, this time, both sides mobilize much more. The number of voters goes up a huge percentage, and the margin in favor of independence drops dramatically. So it falls just beneath the minimum that the Massachusetts legislature set to allow statehood to go forward. So that's why we've got these two 1816 elections. It's only in 1819 when we get this final slam dunk election. This in part has to do with changes in a federal maritime law, the federal coasting law. Again, I can talk more about that in the question and answer period if anyone wants to go down that particular rabbit hole with me. Now, much as I enjoy thinking about this county level voting data, I also think that there is something really misleading about the maps that we're looking at here. You know, these sort of render for us the boundaries of the state of Maine as we understand it today. But this is not at all where the people who voted on the independence question actually lived. And so I want to move on to another map by Moses Greenleaf, that great Maine cartographer I mentioned earlier. And this is really my favorite Moses Greenleaf map, made in 1829. And you can't quite read this perhaps in the fine print, but the title of this is A Map of the Inhabited Part of the State of Maine. Now, we can quibble with inhabited because there certainly are people living in other areas of what we now think of as the state of Maine, but this does accurately represent where people lived who were allowed to vote on the Maine independence question. And part of what makes this map so terrific is the way in which it is color-coded. So the blue areas on this map represent areas of the District of Maine that were inhabited by English speakers up to the time of the American Revolution. And then the red band shows the spread of English-speaking settlement by the presidential election of Jefferson in 1800. And finally, the yellow band is the expansion of English-speaking settlement by the time of statehood in 1820. And a final thing that I really think is fascinating about this map, Moses Greenleaf, the cartographer who made it, he lived in Williamsboro, way up here at the top of the yellow near the compass rose. So I think he was really conscious of how where you lived in Maine might really impact your understanding of the world, your political commitments, a whole range of issues from economic status to religious belief often map on to differences between coastal older settlements and newer, poorer interior settlements. That's another topic I'm happy to talk about a little bit more in the Q&A session if people would like to explore that theme a little more. But I want to take a somewhat closer look at the Rockland area. I think part of many people's passion for history has to do with the local history of where they live, and if they're long-term residents in that place, that often can connect in really a deep way with genealogy. And so I want us to zoom in on, well, we can't really call it the Rockland area. I think Rockland is only incorporated as a city in 1850. So in the statehood era, Rockland was part of Camden. And again, here we are sort of looking at a little inset and thinking about, so according to Moses Greenleaf's map, Camden as a town is sort of partly an older coastal settlement, partly a place that expanded up through the election of Jefferson around 1800. And really, Camden does represent one of these older coastal communities that we might expect to vote pretty strongly against Maine statehood. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. Perhaps primarily, people living on the coast whose livelihoods were connected to commerce and maritime-based trade knew that they had a real advantage in what was called the federal coasting law. And that allowed you not to have to enter into customs when you cross state lines if the state you were trading with was adjacent to the one that you lived in. And Massachusetts has some kind of funny geography. You can actually get all the way to New Jersey before you get to a state that does not border Massachusetts. Now, if Maine becomes independent, that is going to change dramatically, right? Since we've got that annoying little sliver of New Hampshire that is going to prevent you from trading even to Massachusetts without possibly having to enter customs, pay some kind of state tax crossing New Hampshire's boundaries. So that's one reason that coastal communities tended to oppose Maine statehood. There also are just the longer settlement, close ties with Massachusetts family. There also is a sort of religious divide, much stronger Congregationalist traditions on the coast versus more Methodists and Baptists in the interior. And in this era, Massachusetts still has an established state church. So this is a legacy of the Puritan colony of Massachusetts. If you were a Methodist or a Baptist, you might have to pay taxes to support a congregational minister. So you can imagine how if you were a newer settler in an interior area, a Methodist and a Baptist, why you might really be a champion of Maine independence from Massachusetts, and therefore an ability to change the law and get rid of that unusual religious establishment. Again, the US Constitution prohibits that for the national government, but state governments had the right to pass such legislation. And again, Massachusetts was sort of unique in this respect, again, part of that deep Puritan legacy. And in fact, the local voting data that we have for Camden does bear out that vision pretty clearly. It consistently votes well below the state figures for independence. So you might remember 1807 was that low year for the independence vote. Only 26% of voters statewide in the District of Maine wanted to become independent. Just 1 out of 4, that's pretty low. In Camden in 1807, the vote was 7 for independence, 133 against. I mean, that's pretty extreme. I don't think there are many other communities that are quite as lopsided as Camden in 1807. And it basically repeats that in both 1816 votes. Again, far below, almost half of what the statewide average was in terms of favoring independence in both May and September 1816. By the final vote, they do get on board. They're right there at the state average. And perhaps it was largely a commercial concern. Once the federal coasting law had changed, Camden voters were okay with the idea that Maine should become an independent state. Now, I took a look at this fascinating document, which anyone who's interested in doing more local history can download a copy from the UMaine's Fogler Library. This is a very detailed account of the state constitutional convention that was held in December of 1819. Almost every single town in Maine sent a delegate to this. And I always like look up the local representatives who attended and see what sort of stands they took on the issue. And this is the very first local talk I've given where I did not find any recorded commentary by any of the local attendants, delegates to the state constitutional convention. Now, there are more in the area, and perhaps I missed some, But this is the kind of thing that I hope local historical societies or the history room at the Rockland Public Library might help us to understand better. These are not men whose names are familiar to me, but I suspect they do have some local prominence, and perhaps in the question and answer, the discussion period, let's call it, somebody who is a local history buff could share some information with us about people like Nathaniel Martin, who was the Camden representative to the state constitutional convention in December of 1819. I will just point out that not only did Rockland not exist in 1820, Knox County didn't exist in 1820 either. You were still part of Lincoln back then, and you're actually right on the edge of Hancock County, or at least the boundaries of Hancock County then, and Penobscot County to the interior. So a kind of interesting little corner that overlaps some different jurisdictions and some changing jurisdictions in the state of Maine. All right, I've got one last past-present connection to talk about, and then I look forward to moving on to a discussion and turning off my share slide so I can actually see some people's faces instead of talking to my own computer screen. Now, when we're thinking about Maine statehood and the creation of a new sovereign state government that's going to join the United States, I think the next absolutely crucial question that we have to give some thought to is, what did Maine statehood mean for Wabanaki sovereignty? And I really like this map from the Portland Press Herald that reminds us of the extent of the traditional Wabanaki homeland, not just throughout the state of Maine, but also through much of northern and parts of southern New England, and indeed into the provinces of Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton as well, right? This is a large area of Wabanaki sovereignty, and Native American nations in this region had engaged in state-to-state diplomacy and treaty making with various colonial entities, but with the Massachusetts government in particular. And this became a really pressing issue as Maine became a state. If Maine was going to be separate from Massachusetts, would it have to honor the treaty negotiations that had been entered into by the colony and Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which Maine was no longer a part of? Now, there is a lot to say about this very important topic, and I want to organize sort of two broad comments into mentioning some aspects of Wabanaki issues related to statehood that are ones of enormous peril and danger. But I also want to balance the attention to perils with a equally important story of Wabanaki persistence through the statehood era and up into the present. So to take up the perils first, it is, I think, crucial to clearly state that the Maine statehood era intensified Wabanaki dispossession of their homeland. It increased Wabanaki loss of life, and it intensified colonization throughout this traditional region. And one way of marking this is to think a little bit about Native American voting rights in the state of Maine. Now, Indigenous people did not have the right to vote in the United States until a federal law was passed in 1924. And that in itself, I think, is pretty shocking, well into the 20th century before Native Americans were considered appropriate to have the vote in US federal elections. But that federal law in 1924 did not have any bearing on Indigenous people's right to vote in Maine state elections. And Maine state law did not allow Indigenous people to vote until an amendment was passed in 1954. And indeed, it took several years after that until Indian voting actually occurred on a widespread basis in the state of Maine. Maine, I believe, is the second to last state in the United States to allow Indigenous people the right to vote. Now, that is just one example. We could discuss others. But I also want to turn to an equally important aspect of Wabanaki relationship to statehood, and that is to acknowledge the remarkable persistence and engagement of Wabanaki people in public life, in politics and diplomacy throughout this period of real danger. And I think one really signal achievement of the Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy in particular is that they are among the only Native American nations in the United States east of the Mississippi River to maintain a continuous and unbroken, officially recognized legal claim on some part of their pre-colonial homeland. Right? That is a remarkable achievement when we look at the history of Native Americans in the United States east of the Mississippi River. Right? The Penobscot and the Passamaquoddy hold on to these crucial pieces of their pre-colonial homeland. Now, of course, that territory is dramatically reduced, and it is reduced all the faster in the statehood era of the early and mid 19th century. But nonetheless, that retention of Indian Island near Old Town, Maine, that retention of Sipiac, Pleasant Point in down East Maine, this really are signal achievements that we should not forget. There's also a really fascinating story of political persistence of Wabanaki people in the Maine statehood story. Not the politics of individual voting rights, but the politics of having a formal presence in state government. So the Penobscots had a tribal delegate to the Maine state legislature in 1823. Almost from the very first meeting of the Maine legislature, there was an official position for a Penobscot delegate. And the Passamaquoddy would add a delegate in 1842, still in the broad statehood era. And last, the Holton Band of Maliseets would add a representative in 2010. Now, just like with my point about the persistence of part of their traditional homeland, I am not saying this is a perfect or great system. These delegates were non-voting delegates. They did not have the right to vote, but it also is a remarkable, totally unique, in my understanding, experience in state government anywhere else in the United States to have these sorts of positions for Indigenous people. So these represent some of the ways that Wabanaki persistence, even in the onslaught of intensified colonization in the early 19th century, really secure a place for them that lasts into the 21st century. So whether we're looking at the Maine-Missouri Crisis and the persistence of issues of Blackness in national political culture, whether we're looking at vitriolic partisan politics in the statehood process of the Maine statehood movement or contemporary American life, or whether we're thinking about the place of Wabanaki people in Maine society and their relationship to Maine state government. These are all contemporary issues that we cannot really understand and think about how best to deal with in our contemporary circumstances or our future circumstances without understanding their long, deep, fundamental connection to the history of Maine, and in particular to the statehood era. So thank you all for your patience. I am going to stop screen sharing so that I can actually see some faces and hopefully see some questions in the chat area. So if others want to turn on their cameras, that's sort of a nicer way to have a conversation, I think. And anyone could put up their hand and unmute themselves and ask a question, or if you prefer to type something in the chat box, that's also a nice way to get us going with some questions. I am going to step away because my cat is outside. I think she's freezing to death. Susan, if you want to unmute, you could have the first question.
Yes, I wondered if you could say something about the slavery issue and is it the Missouri Compact or and how that impacted Maine and how it was settled.
So were you here at the beginning of the talk? That was my first focus.
Oh, sorry, not the first minute or two.
Yeah, so I started
early.
there. You know, I think I will just say very briefly to recap that, you know, what's really interesting to me about what I would call the Maine-Missouri Crisis is that it divided the 7 US congressmen from Maine. And in fact, a strong majority, 5 of the 7, voted against Maine's statehood because it allowed the expansion of slavery to Missouri. And they've got this terrific newspaper article, letter to the editor sort of thing, where they, or as they called it, an address to the people of Maine, where they explained why they were so opposed to this resolution of the crisis. And so, you know, I do tend to think that that 5-2 balance of the Maine congressman does broadly reflect popular opinion in Maine. I think most white voters in Maine did not want to become a state this way, but it ends up getting pushed through largely because of partisan politics and the operation of the sort of Jeffersonian Republican machine. And I will say a little bit more about that, which I did not talk about in my earlier comments. We have one letter on the left here. Oh, you guys probably can't see my screens. You're just seeing my faces now. John Holmes was the US congressman from Alfred, Maine. And he was a very strong Jeffersonian Republican. He was a strong advocate of accepting the expansion of slavery to Missouri. And the newspaper article that he wrote explaining his vote to the people of Maine, he also sent to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was still alive. Jefferson, of course, the great leader of the political party that John Holmes was a rising member of. And Jefferson wrote back to Holmes And that letter from Jefferson, which you actually can find at the Library of Congress, they've got a very famous letter, and they've scanned it and also transcribed it, so you can read exactly Jefferson's language. And it's quite similar to the language of John Holmes from Maine. They both are making a kind of twisted argument that by allowing slavery to expand to Missouri, you're actually going to weaken it because you're going to disperse it and it will gradually fade away. But that famous the most famous commentary about the Maine-Missouri Crisis is Jefferson's line, it awoke him like a fire bell in the night, that this crisis was going to, and of course it's very prophetic, right? It seems to point to the Civil War. But if you really read Jefferson's letter closely, what he is mad about is not actually the expansion of slavery to Missouri. What he was mad about was what was called the Missouri Compromise line that was going to prohibit the expansion of slavery to other parts of the Louisiana Territory that were north of the southern border of Missouri. So there's a lot to say about this really spectacular clash in the political culture of the early US. And it was, since the Constitution, the first time that slavery forced its way into public discussion and did so in a, just a spectacular manner. It captured the attention of everyone who was politically conscious in the US in 1820. So Kelsey's written a message to the chat. It says, so if Maine reps voted down the Missouri Compromise, how did Maine finally become a state and what happened with Missouri? Great question. So the majority of Maine congressmen opposed the package that had gotten put together by the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, but Maine lost in the national vote. So the national vote in the Congress was 90 in favor and 87 opposed. So again, it could not have been closer, but what I would call the pro-slavery side, to allow Maine and Missouri in together, did prevail at the national level. And, this is one of those vexing aspects of how representative politics work. You can have, and it's obviously quite ironic, right? If the majority of Maine reps are opposed to it, how could they have done it to Maine anyway? But that is part of how national politics operates.
Thank you.
Dale, I think you've got your hand up if you want to unmute.
Thank you, Liam. This is Chip.
Sorry.
That's all right. Very confusing sometimes when you have names Jail and Chip.
I didn't call you and.
That's true, you didn't. We're calling from central Massachusetts, so mine's kind of a Massachusetts-centric question. You said in the very beginning of your presentation that the Massachusetts State House voted to allow Maine to basically go off and create a state. Given the propensity of politicians not to want to give up power easily, what was the reason that the state allowed that? And was it a close question, or was it time for it to happen and the Massachusetts state legislature was just perfectly happy to see Maine head off on its own?
Thanks, I appreciate that question. And it does sort of connect with what Kelsey wrote, right? Like, if Maine reps were opposed to it, how did Maine become independent? Why would Massachusetts legislature allow Maine to go down this course? And I think there are two ways of answering this question, both of which I think are accurate. I mean, one is I do think that Massachusetts politicians took seriously the idea of the will of the people and that you should allow for some kind of representative system. And what's interesting about this long period of Maine statehood, right? I mean, the first calls for Maine to become independent really begin in the late 1780s. And then it kind of gets quieted down, largely because of Shays' Rebellion. It's sort of associated with that sort of riotous behavior. So it sort of gets muffled for a bit. But then when it comes back, we have our first sanctioned state independence vote in 1792. And in the 1790s, when the first two votes were held, Maine independence was a federalist issue that was championed by conservative politicians who were federalists in modern day Portland or the city of Falmouth. And basically, these rich merchants in Falmouth knew that they could never be leaders if they had to compete with Bostonians, but they could be the leading men of Federalist Maine. And I think initially that, didn't really cause necessarily a problem for the strong Federalist political party in Massachusetts. Now, by the first decade of the 19th century, that political situation has really changed. And by 1806, the District of Maine has really big Jeffersonian Republican majorities, even though most of Massachusetts is staunchly Federalist. Although this is less true when you get to Western Mass, which is also kind of like Maine, a little bit more Jeffersonian Republican. So by the time we get to these later votes, there are a lot of Federalists in Massachusetts who would like to get rid of all the Jeffersonian Republicans in Maine. So there's actually a weird way that partisanship and geography work against one another. By the last three votes, if you're a Federalist in Maine, you want to stay part of Massachusetts. But if you're a Federalist in Massachusetts, you'd like to get rid of Maine. And the same is true of the Jeffersonian Republicans. They're spitting mad at each other. The Jeffersonian Republicans in Western Mass are beside themselves that they're going to lose this big block of Jeffersonian Republicans in the District of Maine. So Federalist Massachusetts, by the end, is happy to get rid of Maine. And this actually does connect back to the Wabanaki story as well. After all this struggle about the Maine-Missouri Crisis, and it's finally resolved, then there's some real concern that this issue of will Massachusetts's treaty obligations be respected by Maine comes up. And Massachusetts ends up giving Maine, I think it's $30,000 in order to ensure that Maine keeps up Massachusetts' treaty obligations, right? There's so much want to get rid of them by then that Massachusetts is sweetening the deal to get rid of these lunatic Jeffersonian Republicans from Maine. So that's my take on it.
Thank you.
So I would just want to say thank you for coming out tonight. I really enjoy talking about the commemoration of the bicentennial and thinking about these past-present connections between life in the 21st century and life in the Maine statehood era. There are, of course, all sorts of differences, but also really important connections. And to me, that's the most fascinating part of history, is thinking about both what stays the same, but also what changes, and how do we think about that balance and relationship. So I hope you all keep warm on this chilly evening. And again, my thanks to the Rockland Public Library for hosting this event and for all of you in coming out tonight. Have a good, warm winter.